Welcome to The Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints Hour. The conflict in Gaza. Now CUPE is calling for a boycott of Israel academics and the issue of media coverage. Is propaganda at work? Stay tuned. These are the issues we're presenting today to our Viewpoints guests for commentary. And again, it's all about Gaza. Israel's daily 3-hour truces are being called a glimmer of hope. But here's the latest. Rockets have been fired from Lebanon. And the Canadian Union of Public Employees has called for a ban of all Israeli academics on university campuses here. Meanwhile, the union's president, Sid Ryan, has apologized for comparing the Jews to the Nazis. And some media coverage about the Gaza conflict. Is it promoting propaganda? Now let's meet our Viewpoints guests. Paul McKeever is leader of the Freedom Party of Ontario, and Raheel Raza is a journalist that not long ago returned from the Middle East. And you, the viewer, you are our third guest. Feel free to call in at any time about any, and I'm saying any here, of your comments concerning Gaza. Now, our approach today, we're referring to 3 specific topics about Gaza. We covered this at length on our last Viewpoints, a little bit about the history of Gaza there. Today, we're opening the lines, though, that even though we're talking about a specific angle of this issue that's happening here, that conflict, we want to hear your thoughts overall. So feel free to call in at any time. Your calls are important to us, and don't be shy. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you, Christine.
Now, as I mentioned, right now, the latest is there's a 3-hour truce going on every day, and some are saying it's a glimmer of hope. It's allowing some medical supplies to flow in and so forth. The latest news comes from a couple of rockets fired from Lebanon. So on one hand, we're seeing a glimmer of hope. On the other hand, we're wondering, well, what's up with this? Because from what I'm understanding, both Lebanon and Israel are downplaying this incident. I don't know how the two of you feel about this, because one thing we're going to be getting into today too is what projections the two of you perhaps have in mind as to this conflict going on. But I'm going to start with you on this one, Raheel. In terms of what we're seeing happening, some are calling it, the EU have referred to the Israeli defensive, not as an offensive, but as a defensive. There are others that are referring to it as an offensive, and I'd like to know how you feel about this particular matter.
Well, first of all, Christine, obviously we have all understood that this is a very highly politicized, polarized,
and emotional,
complicated situation.
Certainly.
Where everyone has an opinion, and that opinion may be different from everyone else's. And so, you know, depending on who you are, and I think it's important for me to say that for some of us, when we are talking about this issue, in order to have a balanced perspective, we have to move out perhaps of our nationalities and our ethnicities and our faith and speak about this from a human perspective. Now, from your humanitarian perspective, whether it is a defensive or an offensive on part of Israel, the fact is that too many lives have gone. You know, and one life lost is one life too many, whether it is Palestinian or Israel.
Agreed.
You see, so we have to look at this in the larger picture. And of course, as you say, they will continue to argue about whether it is a defensive or an offensive. And very often what I've seen in the debates that take place, they start discussing this from 1948 or 1967. And then what happens is that it becomes a debate that doesn't even talk about what's happening right now. So there are many different realities, there are many different truths, there are many different opinions, but there are some facts that remain, and one of them is the fact that Israel has a right to exist and has a right to defend itself. But at the same time, Palestinians have a right to exist in dignity and in equality, just like the Israelis do. So I think that the conversation needs to start here today. As we speak, lives are being lost. Is that important to us? And I would like to have seen Canadian government broker this dialogue to say that let's not have any more lives lost. It is a humanitarian crisis.
Everything you've said, I think any reasonable person couldn't agree with, that both the Palestinians and the Israelis have a right to exist in dignity.
Yes.
The biggest question, though, that seems to be largely unanswered is, how do you attain that? When there are groups that are saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, Hamas is one of them. They've been throwing rockets into Israel on a daily basis. We're seeing deaths there. You acknowledge that it's a shame to have Israeli children and women and the population, innocent civilians dying. In fact, it's a shame on both sides to see these deaths. Hamas is also using human shields, and those same women and children that are being spoken about here getting killed, they're hiding behind them. What do you do with something like this? What does Israel do to protect itself in the middle of such a conflict and a tragedy?
But this is a question that we have to ask the superpowers, the supreme powers, those who are supposed to exist to create this kind, to have conflict resolution. The United Nations, which was supposed to have been based on justice and humanitarian issues, is totally ineffectual in a situation like this. What needs to happen is, well, I believe that the neighbors of Israel and Palestine, they need to recognize Israel as a country so that they can have a dialogue. Because you can't have a dialogue with an entity that you don't recognize. See, and again, as I said, while they keep harping back to what happened, the reality is that Israel is 60 years old. It exists and it will not stop existing whether rockets are fired or not.
Well said.
So we have to look at the end result. What is Israel going to achieve by indiscriminately and heavily bombing civilians and school children? It's not going to get rid of Hamas.
I want to get back to you, but what you said about the neighbors is something that we have to address today. There are many questions being asked, like why aren't we hearing from Egypt and Saudi Arabia particularly? And that's something we're going to, and Jordan, those three in particular. But I want to hear, Paul, how do you feel about this one?
Well, just a few things. I mean, I guess on the substance, I wouldn't disagree with many of the things Raheel said. But let's just start at the beginning. There aren't many realities as I see it. There's one reality. And we either adhere to it, we either recognize it and act according to it, or we don't. The only way to know what that reality is not to refer to ethnicity or to supreme powers or anything like that, but rather to apply our own senses and rational faculty to an assessment of the facts as they present themselves to our senses. And when it comes to the morality, when it comes to the issue of defense versus offense, morality is the field we ought to be looking to. Clearly here, every individual should be free. But not every government has a right to exist. There is no right for a group of people to form a government that will enslave a people. There's no right to form a dictatorship, no right to form a collectivistic, oppressive government. There is a right to be free of violations of your own life, liberty, and property. What we have in Gaza right now is an organization, Hamas, that is dedicated to the destruction of Israel, that is largely collectivist. And we're seeing collectivist organizations around the world supporting it because it's collectivist. It is not a government that wants freedom for Palestinians. It's a government that wants to form up an oppressive government, and it sees Israel as the sole instance of Western philosophy in the whole region. It is an example of everything that they are opposed to. Individualism, people being able to differ in terms of their opinions, express their opinions without going to jail, freedom of the press, a justice system with an objective system of law. It's not a perfect country. It's socialist, and I'm not a big fan of socialism, as you probably know. However, there are some basic recognitions, Western recognitions of the individual rights of every human being, regardless of genetic makeup or a peaceful personal lifestyle choice. So I think it's right to say, as Raheel said, we have to put aside ethnicity and etc., but the right focus should be on the individual and morality.
Now, Hamas would insist that, hey, we were elected. However, it's not quite the way, it's not quite so. But Raheel?
Well, they are. I mean, we again, that is another reality that the Western world must accept. Because you see what happens in situations like this, that the double standards and the hypocrisy of some of the Western powers and those people who are right there comes through as well. And this, as you mentioned, Paul, that in the essence of truth and justice, we can see this. So it's one thing to say that we want democracy in that part of the world, but here you have a democratically elected party, and we can't deny their existence. It's already happened once before in the history in Algeria, where if that particularly democratically elected party doesn't happen to toe the line, you want to say, no, we don't. No, they are. Again, there's one thing to have wishful thinking, but there's another thing which is a reality that exists, and this is a reality. However, as a democratically elected party, they owe a responsibility to their people.
Yes, they do.
The Palestinians, and one of those responsibilities is to look for their protection, is to protect them and find the right kind of solution.
So how have they been faring at protecting their own Palestinian people, according to your opinion?
Obviously not very well, because constantly taking pot shots and firing rockets when it is in the interest, when it doesn't go in the interest of all Palestinians. And another important point here also is that in this highly polarized debates, you rarely hear the voices of peace from both sides. There are Palestinians and Muslims who don't necessarily accept Hamas's tactics,
yes,
and they're speaking out. But when you have demonstrations, when you have loud voices who are giving, it's just blame putting, then these voices are drowned out. Similarly, you have Jews and Israelis who are not in favor of Israel's mighty, indiscriminate bombing of Gaza. So, certainly on both sides there are people who are looking for some sort of balance. And these are the people who need to perhaps find ways in which a political solution can be brokered.
I'm not sure what context exactly Raheel was using balance in, so I wouldn't want to jump on that too much. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a difference between, the idea that the government represents the governed, which is democracy as opposed to, for example, theocracy, and the idea of elections. So you can elect a government. That doesn't mean you have a democracy. You may have a theocratic government that's been elected. And I think it's important to recognize that. Now, what is the significance of the fact that Hamas was elected by a majority or by a plurality? Well, it means that a lot of Palestinians share their views.
And that's another point. Plus, there were a lot of conflicts around that so-called election to begin with, something we're going to discuss some more. Once again, our lines are open. Your views are important to us, so right after we come back from the break, we're going to get to you. Stay tuned.